Good morning, students. Welcome back again. Yesterday we started doing Unit 3, Section B, just before recess. It's a story written by James Van Pelt. It's a wonderful story. It's a science fiction. In the story we read yesterday that Parker is the boy in the school. He's in 3rd class, and Mr. Earl is his teacher. He is marking their papers. Parker finds a sun in his desktop one day, and now he is giving him some pebbles, some twigs, and he is even giving him chewing gum to eat. And day by day he is growing up. He is shining brightly and growing up. All the books, the tiffin box, the stationery item, pencil box, tissue box, everything had been swallowed by that sun. Now, Mr. Earl, who was marking their papers, he had given them the task of reading the textbook, but instead of reading the book, Parker was just looking at that sun. So, Mr. Earl called up his name and told him to go at the end of the class and sit with the 3 more students who were already there and take his textbook with him. So when Parker said that he did not have his book, so Mr. Earl got angry and he had to stand up from his chair, because it was on very rare occasions Mr. Earl left his seat, Mr. Earl left his chair, because until and unless the crime was not terrible, he did not leave his place. Now let's read further. You, young man, are irresponsible. Remember our talk about responsibility on the first day of the school? He looked at each of his students, who nodded in turn. Nodded means say yes by moving their head. Isn't your book in your desk where it belongs? Now he asked that, isn't it in your desk? No, sir, said Parker. How could he explain about swirling dust, the pulsing red glow, the sun's pinpoint of light? How can he explain it to him? Because he would never understand what is that. Nobody would understand that there was a sun inside his desk. Oh, of course it is. That's where your books should always be. Everything in its place. A place for everything. Isn't that right? His question sounded like an accusation. Accusation means as if he's finding fault. He is like Parker is at fault, and he is just showing his fault to him. Mr. Earl is showing his Parker's fault to him, that this is your crime. This is your fault. So he told him that it was everything that he had belonged to his desk, and everything should be in his desk where it belonged. Parker nodded. But my book isn't there, Mr. Earl. The teacher took 2 long strides. Strides means steps, and stood beside Parker's desk. Before the boy could speak, Mr. Earl threw the desktop open. For a second, he stared into it. A white glow reflected off his face. What is this? He said, as he reached towards the brightness. Careful, Mr. Earl, Parker started to say, but it was too late. The teacher screeched. Screeched means screamed before lurching. Lurching means move unsteadily against the desk. He went down quickly, his feet vanishing into the desk last. Vanishing means getting lost. The sun had swallowed Mr. Earl. Before Parker could stop him, before he could say anything to Mr. Earl, the sun, because since Mr. Earl had opened the desktop, and when he saw the sun inside the desk, he asked, what is this? And before he could do anything else, the sun had swallowed him. A long silence filled the room. Parker stood up and walked back to his desk. The sun within had grown, its heat baking like a tiny oven. He closed the top which snapped. Snap means closed down hard on its own at the last moment. The other students hadn't moved. Parker looked at them. They looked at him. Over the intercom. Intercom means a system for communication through radio or telephone. A bell softly chimed. Chime means rang. Recess, said Parker, and they all ran outside to play. And when the bell rang for the recess, all the students went outside for playing. So that's the story. I hope you have understood it. Now you have to read it carefully and write down the word meanings in your notebook. Now, let's read further. First of all, we will do about the author. James Van Pelt is a full-time writer in Western Colorado. His work has appeared in many science fiction and fantasy magazines and anthologies. He's been a finalist for Nebula Award and been reprinted in several years' best collections. His first young adult novel, Pandora's Gun, was released from Fairwood Press in August 2015. His latest collection, The Experience Arcade and Other Stories, was released at World Fantasy Convention in 2017. So he is a renowned science fiction writer. His writings, his stories are really very good. That's why they have been reprinted every year. Now, there is a brief summary of the story. Just Before Recess is a 2008 science fiction short story by James Van Pelt. It is about a boy who finds a small sun in his school desk. He is astonished to find it there in his desk. He starts feeding him the pebbles, gravel, and all his school supplies. But the only problem is when his teacher, Mr. Earl E. Capital, asks him to get him a reading book, he does not have it. He cannot tell this to Mr. Earl. So when Mr. Earl himself comes to his desk and sees the pulsing sun, the sun swallows him and the whole class gets to play in the recess. So that's the short summary of the story in short. Right? Now let's start doing the question answers. These word meanings you have to write the same way as they are given. Gravel, noun. Noun, it is used as a noun in the text and the meaning is crushed rock pebbles. Vanished, adjective, varnished, adjective, covered with varnish, a liquid used to protect wood. So that's in the same way you need to write the word meanings in your notebook. Now, read to understand. Answer these questions with reference to context. Before the boy could speak, Mr. Earl threw the desktop open. For a second, he stared into it. A white glow reflected off his face. "What is this?" he said as he reached towards the brightness. Why did Mr. Earl throw open Parker's desk? Now, the answer is Mr. Earl threw open Parker's desk to find his book. What did Mr. Earl stare at in the desk? Mr. Earl stared at the pulsing sun in the desk. What happened as Mr. Earl reached towards the brightness? As Mr. Earl went near the sun swallowed him. The sun swallowed him. Now, B part, answer these questions. Why would Mr. Earl glance up once in a while? What did his glare mean? Mr. Earl was glancing up at the third graders to make sure none of them were talking or making notes or looking out of the window. His glare means that child's name would soon go up on the board with the other kids who had lost their lunch privileges for the day. Children, you have to listen to the answers very carefully so that you can write them down in your notebook, okay? What did Parker see when he opened his desk to put in his lunchbox? When he opened his desk to put in his lunchbox, he saw a cloud swirled in the space, and at its center was a dull, pulsing red glow. What made Parker's desktop warm and the bottom of the desk toasty? The sun kept in the desk made Parker's desktop warm and the bottom of the desk toasty. How did the sun inside Parker's desk get him into trouble? His book had disappeared into the sun along with everything else. Parker could not explain what had happened to Mr. Earl. So Mr. Earl went to his desk to see where exactly his book had gone. But when Mr. Earl threw the desktop open, he went down quickly into the desk. Question number 5. Where do you think the sun in the desk was getting its energy from? The sun was getting energy from gravel, pebbles, twigs, gums. Parker was feeding and from the school supplies kept in his desk. Question number 6. Careful, Mr. Earl, said Parker. What did Parker want to warn Mr. Earl about? Parker wanted to warn Mr. Earl about the sun that was in his desk. So that's all for today, students. Next part we will discuss in the next video. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.